This was already causing unrest in the country during Selassie's reign, but as we will see, this has been compounded in more recent times. Of all the ethnic peoples of Ethiopia, those who were most antagonistic to the government were the Tigrayans, who constituted a sizable proportion of the overall population, roughly 7 or 8%, and were the dominant people in Tigray province in the north of the country. The antipathy of Selassie's government towards the Tigrayans was clear for all to see in the 1950s, as the imperial government persistently neglected the province despite mounting evidence of pressure on its resources and the possibility of famine as a result of the destruction of crops by locusts, drought, and disease, outbreaks of smallpox, typhus, and other high mortality illnesses. When Tigray eventually did enter famine in 1958, the central government in Addis Ababa did very little to try to relieve the situation, leading to tens of thousands of deaths. Thereafter, a more concerted effort was made in 1959 to address the situation, with Selassie's government being provided with considerable aid from the administration of US President Dwight Eisenhower. Nevertheless, by the time the worst of the famine subsided in 1961, it is estimated that about 100,000 people had died in Tigray and surrounding regions, while renewed famine struck northern Ethiopia again in the mid-1960s. While Selassie's reign was increasingly being blackened by controversies at home, including famine in Tigray, a war of independence in Eritrea, and ethnic tensions within Ethiopia, Selassie and, by extension, Ethiopia continued to hold a position of considerable international respect. As one of the world's longest-serving heads of state, he was usually afforded a position of considerable preeminence at major international events, such as the funeral of President John F. Kennedy in Washington, D.C. in 1963, and of the former French President Charles de Gaulle in France in 1970. Ethiopia also supplied peace contingents to many areas of conflict, such as the Congo in the early 1960s, and became a prominent nation within the non-aligned movement of nations, which were not members of either NATO or the Warsaw Pact, the respective military alliances of the United States and the Soviet Union in the Cold War. Perhaps most significant of all in terms of international diplomacy at this time was Selassie's leading role in the establishment of the Organization of African Unity in 1963, the forerunner of the African Union. The headquarters of the Organization of African Unity was located in Addis Ababa for many years under Selassie's rule. Not only did Selassie continue to enjoy a vaunted reputation on the international stage in the second iteration of his reign after the Second World War, but he was viewed by many as a messianic character. In the 1930s, a new quasi-religion and social movement emerged in parts of Africa and the Caribbean, one which mixed elements of the Back to Africa movement, which proclaimed that people of African descent in the Americas would wish to return to the African continent now that slavery was at an end, and also Ethiopianism, a branch of Christian worship which had arisen in the late 19th century amongst African Christians, one which looked to the Ethiopian church as a native Christian church within Africa, rather than having African Christians take their directives from European religious leaders in Rome, Canterbury, or elsewhere. This new movement combined specific belief in elements of biblical theology and a wide array of different social beliefs. It took its name from Selassie's regent title, dating from the 1920s, Rastafari. Thus, the new religion was known as Rastafarianism, and proponents of it viewed Selassie as a messiah, one who may be the second coming of Christ. These views must be understood in light of Ethiopia's position as the only African state which resisted colonial conquest in the 19th century. Selassie did not explicitly seek to be recognized as a messianic character within Rastafarianism, but he also did not attempt to refute efforts to exalt him in this way. Thus, as Rastafarianism gained in popularity in the 1950s in countries like Jamaica, Selassie took on an unusual significance for many people who had never been anywhere near Ethiopia. In contrast to the view of him within Rastafarianism as a quasi-messianic figure, Haile Selassie was actually becoming more oppressive at home in Ethiopia.